When we listen to each other, we do so to understand and share our feelings. And it's similar with nature. The sounds of nature are rich in information, and when we listen, we can find a personal connection with life around us. So today I would like to invite you to listen more deeply to nature, and I'm going to share a little of what I've come to understand by doing so. And I'll begin with birdsong, because birds are acoustic creatures, and they create the most extraordinary variety of sounds. They do so with their unique vocal organ called the syrinx. And when you consider just how significant birdsong is to them, you can appreciate that the evolution of the syrinx is as important for them as the development of feathers and flight itself. This is the European nightingale, famed for its song. I've got to admit, when I first encountered them, I was a little disappointed. I thought they sounded a bit twittery. However, as I listened more deeply, I could hear that here was a bird that poured out its spirit in song of such richness and diversity and variety and, dare I say it, creativity. Now, in playing this to you, I'd like to introduce spectrograms. A spectrogram is a visual representation of what you're hearing, with time progressing horizontally and the intensity of sounds from low to high frequencies displayed vertically. So just have a listen to what this nightingale is doing. Each bird species uses specific vocalizations and vocal behaviors to facilitate the way that it lives in the world. So when you're hearing birdsong, you're hearing how that species survives. And just when you've got your head around the simplicity of that understanding, a bird will come along and do something utterly unexpected. On this occasion, I'd set up my microphones near the bow of a spotted bowerbird. And in over 2 hours, he'd done little more than his usual rasping and hissing calls. But when I returned to retrieve my rig, he suddenly began imitating the scariest sounds that he knew in an attempt to scare me off. The sounds of not one, but 2 birds of prey, a whistling kite and a brown falcon. When I encounter behaviour like this, it reminds me that birds are not simple instinctive animals. They are intelligent creatures. And that birdsong is an expression of varying degrees of avian intelligence. Now, compared to the often precise sounds that birds use, mammal vocalizations are more individual. They are reflective of character, of mood, personality, and emotion. I love this next recording. But getting it was one of the most intimidating exercises because it involved getting my microphones within 30 metres of 200 of Africa's least predictable and most dangerous animals. However, this was necessary for me to capture the full dynamics of their vocalizations. And I wonder whether in listening you can feel some mammal empathy with these lazing hippos. Mammal and bird vocalizations are often very complex, and the culmination of evolution, particularly over the last few tens of millions of years. But other sounds in the natural world, chorus of crickets on a warm evening, frogs after rain, are far more ancient and hint at the very beginnings of animal communication. So when we listen to the sounds of nature today, we're hearing the story of our planet. And this gives me perspective in my listening. So too does the realization that in my lifetime we could be losing some of these voices. This is a regent honeyeater. I could tell you about the large flocks that early settlers encountered over 100 years ago, of the pitifully few remaining wild birds and the conservation and research efforts being focused on them now. But what I'd like to do is let you hear why losing a species such as this would be a great tragedy. Here is the beautiful living spirit of the regent honeyeater. When we hear individual creatures, we can hear their consciousness in the world. But when we listen more inclusively to all the sounds of nature around us, we can hear dynamics and interaction, we can hear relationships, we can hear processes in the ecosystem, we can hear how nature actually works. And this first became apparent to me in the experience of a bird wave. Now, a bird wave is a mixed species feeding flock that moves through the forest as a group. And in tropical regions, they can be a breathtaking experience involving perhaps dozens of species and hundreds of individual birds. So imagine yourself in a rainforest such as this one in Sulawesi, Indonesia. Everything is still, everything is quiet. And then you notice a single bird fly in. It begins calling, and then another one, and another, and another. A few minutes later, the forest is full of birdsong. There are birds everywhere. There is movement everywhere. They're hopping along branches and through the undergrowth. Every leaf seems to have a bird hanging off it. In India, ornithologists have told me they've observed that first bird that flies in is often a racket-tailed drongo. It is an extraordinary mimic, and they suspect that, like the Pied Piper, it draws the rest of the flock through the forest with it, while the integrity of the flock is maintained by all those individual contact calls. So in a bird wave, we can hear the inner workings of a complex, dynamic, cooperative behaviour involving many, many species. But for me personally, the more profound understanding about how nature functions has come from listening to something far less exotic, far more familiar. It's the dawn chorus. I don't know how many dawn choruses I've listened to and recorded over the years, but I've come to hear them as a nuanced negotiation conducted primarily between individuals of the same species to define their territories and their breeding relationships. So when a bird establishes a new territory, it will often adopt the local dialect to signal that it now belongs. And then it will alternate that song backwards and forwards with its neighbours. And here are a pair of white-fronted honeyeaters doing just that. They are recognising and acknowledging each other. So across the avian world, birds use song and sound to negotiate their relationships rather than actually physically compete, rather than physically fight. This is a supreme adaptation. So, negotiated relationships, cooperative behaviours, intelligence. Together, I've come to appreciate these as indicating a deeper principle, that natural systems thrive not by engagement with competition, as we often understand, but a quite different process that minimises and avoids a lot of the detrimental effects of competition. And the reason is simple. In life, vying over resources is costly. It's risky, it expends energy, it induces stress, it's a distraction, and it may only lead to short-term benefits. So a species that competes is disadvantaged relative to a species that is adapted to not having to. Over time, over evolutionary time, life differentiates into species ever more refined in their own ecological niche, their own way of being in the world. The outcome of this process is biodiversity, which I think of as nature's spectacular success at finding ways of minimising the damage of competition. So bringing this back to sound, that sound is so fundamental to biodiversity and species identity leads to an interesting idea. That changes in repertoire and vocal behaviour can be indicative of the emergence of new species. And we have a wonderful example of that in a local songbird. And see whether you recognise it. It's a golden whistler. They're found widely throughout eastern and southern Australia and with races throughout the western Pacific Islands. So when I visited the Solomon Islands recently, I was curious to hear one. And I spoke to my local guide. He said, "I will take you to hear one tomorrow morning. Actually, they are my favourite songbird." And I thought, well, that makes sense. I mean, they have a very pleasant song. So the next morning we rose early and we set off in the early hours in the dark along this winding, narrow track through dense tropical jungle. And after over an hour of trekking, we stopped and I set up my equipment to await the dawn chorus. It didn't happen. What did happen was the golden whistler. It was the loudest songbird I have ever encountered. It was close to overloading my microphones. I had to turn down the input gain on my recorder. It was distorting my eardrums. And once it had begun singing, it sung continuously for over 2.5 hours. This is the Solomon Islands golden whistler. No doubt this bird's loud song is an adaptation to the densely vegetated habitat in which it lives. But in the process of developing this new repertoire, it's become a new species. Ornithologists have now given provisional species status to this bird as the Oriole Whistler. So to sum up, when we listen to individual animals in the world, we can hear their sentience and their absolute right to share this planet with us. When we listen to all the sounds of nature together, we can hear that life is shaped more by relationships of compatibility and mutual benefit than competition, and that sound has shaped life itself. Sound, that mysterious, invisible, ephemeral phenomena, is the dark matter of evolution. So I invite you to listen more deeply to nature, to spend more time in wild places. The wilder the better. And when you're there, to pause and be still and to listen to life around you. Perhaps, like myself and others, you'd like to make your own sound recordings. But whatever you do, I hope you listen with an open heart and a curious mind, because your personal relationship with nature and your place within the interconnectedness of all of life is audible.